This project was made possible with support from California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Visit calhum.org. The Amargosa Conservancy, working toward a sustainable future for the Amargosa River and Basin through science, stewardship, and education. Learn more at amargosaconservancy.org. The Oregon-California Trails Association, preserving the historic emigrant trails legacy by promoting research, education, preservation, and public awareness of America's emigrant trails and their history. Learn more at OCTA-trails.org.
This is Santa Fe. Founded in 1610, Santa Fe became the capital of New Mexico and is now known as the oldest state capital in the United States. The Santa Fe region, long settled by Native Americans, had seen an increasing Spanish presence since 1535. Conquistador Juan de Oñate began colonization of the region under Spanish rule back in 1598. In 1829, a Santa Fe merchant named Antonio Armijo set out from Abacu, near Santa Fe. He had 31 men and a mule train loaded with woolen goods. In the days before the Transcontinental Railroad, mule trains were a prominent means of hauling freight in the West. Armijo was bound for California to sell his blankets and other goods, and to buy mules to sell in Santa Fe for a significant profit. His trip was a success and inspired others to try it. The Old Spanish Trail was born. Much of what became the trail was already well used by natives long before Europeans arrived. Spaniards had explored and used parts of it since the 1700s, and Americans began using the route in what is now Mexican territory in the early 1800s. The Spanish, and later the Mexicans and Americans, were seeking a reliable overland route from Santa Fe in New Mexico to California. One of the trail's most noted historians, Edward Leo Lyman, has written and taught about the trail, Utah, and the West for over 40 years. He was recently featured in a special 4-part podcast series to kick off commemoration of Utah's 125th anniversary of statehood.
When New Mexican officials authorize the first trader who wants to try that trail from Santa Fe to California, a guy named Antonio Armijo, does it. It's in 1829, so that begins the use of the Old Spanish Trail. 1829. They're taking mostly woolen goods and a few small manufactured goods from Santa Fe to LA, where they sell easily. And with their money, they realize that they can buy a huge number of horses and mules for a very small price. Maybe $5 for horses, $10 for mules, which they can sell for over $50 in Santa Fe. But if they take the Santa Fe Trail to Missouri, they might sell them some of the mules for $200. Missouri mules are actually California.
It may be difficult to believe today, but the vast ranchos around Los Angeles once were filled with herds of thousands of horses. So many that the Old Spanish Trail became a route for driving purchased and stolen horses back to Santa Fe and often on to Missouri on the Santa Fe Trail. The Old Spanish Trail had numerous variations on routes of the trail over time. Parts of it later became usable by wagons. The complete route ran about 1,200 miles. As trail historian Leroy Hafen noted, the Old Spanish Trail was the longest, crookedest, most arduous pack mule route in the history of America. The route was a microcosm of the West itself, used by Native Americans, missionaries, Mexican traders, American mountain men, prospectors, Mormons, horse thieves, and slavers. The Old Spanish Trail definitely had its dark side.
Paiutes become the main victims of a major slave trade. In women and children, many times kidnapped and sold to New Mexican slave traders who are willing to exchange a lot of horses for Native Americans. And it's horrible. Many of those villages disappeared because of a slave trade attack.
The stretch of the Old Spanish Trail that runs from Mountain Springs, Nevada to Salt Creek, California provides some of the best opportunities to explore the trail today and to learn about the changing landscape of historical trails in general. It's hard to believe now, but Las Vegas was once a vital stop on the Old Spanish Trail. The Meadows was given its name by Rafael Rivera, a member of Armijo's 1829 expedition. Native Americans had lived in the valley for over 10,000 years, and the Paiutes had been in the area for 1,000 years or so by the time Armijo's mules arrived. The grass and water here were one of the few oases travelers could rely upon along the trail. From Las Vegas, Armijo's route took him up across the Spring Mountains, where Mountain Springs was an opportune place to rest, graze, and water mules and horses. A later branch of the trail ran south of Las Vegas and through another pass in the Spring Mountains before rejoining Armijo's route near Emigrant Pass. John Hyatt, an organic chemist by training with his doctorate from Yale, has been passionately working on conservation issues and the establishment of designated wilderness for nearly 40 years. He's on the board of directors for the Amargosa Conservancy and is involved with numerous conservation-oriented organizations in Nevada and California.
The Old Spanish Trail was really a trip from one spring to another. You had to have water. That's crucial here. You had to have graze for your animals, and so it was really a series of jumps from one water spot to another. On the other side of Las Vegas, there was a long dry stretch between the Muddy River and Las Vegas. That was difficult for them. And then going west, there's some other dry stretches that are pretty long and were difficult. And this whole trip was actually fairly difficult. The original people that used it were Mexican traders from Santa Fe. They had horses and mules, and it really was a trail. Later on, when the Mormons were using it to go from southern Utah to southern California, it became a road because they had wagons. And wagons are much more problematic in this part of the country because you've got sand, you have rocky things, and wagons were breaking down all the time. They're really hard to pull. And when you read some of the accounts that people wrote in those days, they talk about heavy going. Basically, that means they're going through sand. And that's a lot of work, trying to pull a wagon through sand. It's truly amazing the amount of ground those people covered in a pretty short period of time, because they pretty much had to go from one spring to another, preferably in one day, but at most in 2 days, because they'd be then before they got there, they'd run out of food and water. They tried to time their travels to spring and fall when the weather was most favorable for travel here. This is not much change from the way it was 150 years ago. We're in the Spring Mountains, and they're called the Spring Mountains because there are a lot of springs here, aptly named. And the reason there are a lot of springs here is because this is a high range of mountains. Mount Charleston's 11,900 feet high, and because of that elevation, basically they get snow. Quite a lot of snow historically, more than 100 inches a year in the higher elevations here. And with that amount of water and the fact that these are limestone mountains by and large, and that water soaks in and emerges as spring someplace else, lower down, it was incredibly important for all sorts of travelers here. If you look at the trees around here, they're dominated by pinyon trees and juniper. Those pinyon trees were a source of food, pinyon nuts, for people that lived here. So this area, you can see, is all full of grass, and some of this is old grass. It's thatch from years past. Native Americans almost certainly would have burned this periodically to stimulate new grass, and the reason they did that was because of bighorn sheep. Prior to Anglo settlement, the dominant ungulate in Nevada was the bighorn sheep. Deer were very rare at that point in time. So Native Americans depended upon bighorn sheep as a meat source, as leather for clothes and various other things. And so they would have done everything to facilitate habitat for bighorn sheep and burning off these patches of grass, the old dead stuff, so that new green tender shoots would come up, would entice bighorn sheep to come here, not just for the water, but for the grass.
As the Old Spanish Trail heads westward from Mountain Springs, it follows Highway 160 for a time before the highway veers to the northwest. Travelers who wish to walk a portion of the trail, once used by wagons, may access it just south of the highway on Sandy Valley Road before it reaches Stump Springs and then crosses into California. The trail is also accessible by Mesquite Valley Road as it climbs up from California Valley to Emigrant Pass across the Nopah Mountains. This stretch of the Old Spanish Trail was developed into a wagon road that linked Salt Lake City to Southern California by Mormons and 49ers back in the late 1840s. It was then improved in the 1850s. While the Old Spanish Trail continued to be mostly a trade route, both with mule teams and later, with mostly wagons, emigrants did travel over the trail as well. With the opening of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, the wagon road saw a decline in use, but until the Santa Fe Railroad arrived in Southern California in 1883, long-haul wagons continued to use the road through the Mojave Desert. Emigrant Pass is possibly the best location for travelers to see and walk on both the wagon and pack mule trails, as the two converge at the top of the pass. From the pass, it's all downhill to an important stop on the trail at Resting Springs. Resting Springs is on private property, but the area can be viewed from the Old Spanish Trail Highway.
This was a very important place on the Old Spanish Trail because of water. 150, 170 years ago, this would have been grassland, and the only trees here probably would have been mesquite, maybe some willow trees, some cottonwoods.
Resting Springs is an excellent example of how historically important sites can change over time. These springs were originally home to Native Americans and then to travelers on the Old Spanish Trail as well. But while travelers like John Fremont and Kit Carson found natural springs in grass when they passed through here in 1844, today's landscape has altered dramatically.
People would have stopped here going both ways on the trail to rest and recuperate, and specifically to let their animals recuperate, because there was grass here. And grass was as important in those days as gasoline is today. Okay, so this area behind me and to my left here that you can see, this green stuff surrounded by a white fence, that is the original site of Resting Springs. That's where the water came out of the ground originally. That's been modified. They basically put in a piping system there, and all of the water is now piped off to those ponds downstream and to irrigate all of the trees that have been planted in this area. And the Old Spanish Trail and the road, the Mormon Road, actually were up here on this bench across this way. And they came down from Emigrant Pass, which is over there, and to this location, which was incredibly important to people on that trail because of the water here.
In an area with scarce resources for both humans and animals, mesquite pods were an important food source for native people.
If you just take one and break it in half and chew on it, today it tastes very sweet. There's a lot of sugar in it, and so the Native Americans would take that material, grind it up, and actually add some water to it and make a patty out of it, dry it, and they could store that stuff for months and months, and it was a source of food for them all year. Very important. It was important to them for its food properties, but it was also important to have other things here. And so we assume that they probably burned this area periodically, maybe every 50 years or so. which kept the mesquite in check and allowed grasses to proliferate. With the advent of horses, cattle, mules, and the grazing they did, they certainly overgrazed the area, and they also would have eaten some of the mesquite pods because they are very tasty. And when those seeds go through the gut of a grazing animal, they come out and they germinate at a much higher percentage than you would if they were just dropped on the ground. And so the grazing animals help spread the seeds of mesquite, and with also the change in the presence of Native Americans and their traditional practices of burning, mesquite essentially took over. So what we're seeing today is very different than what Fremont would have seen when he came here in 1844, in which there was a lot of grass, much grassland. But that's part of change, and what's important is that we recognize that the changes have taken place and that what we're seeing, while interesting, is not exactly the same it was 170 years ago. So Resting Springs is here because there's a geologic feature which doesn't allow the water to continue to move underground. It forces it to the surface, and hence we have a spring. So other springs on the trail, such as Stump Spring, the same thing is true there. That spring is essentially dry today, and some of that may be due to climate change, and certainly a portion of it is also due to the fact that there's a lot of groundwater pumping in the Pahrump Valley, which has lowered the water table there, and it's continuing to lower the water table there by about 1 foot a year.
From Resting Springs, near the Paiute village of Yaga, also near where the small unincorporated desert town of Tecopa is today, the old Spanish Trail follows the Amargosa River south, passing near the present-day site of the China Ranch date farm, and on to Salt Creek, before it turns back to the north to flow into Death Valley. Portions of the Amargosa River have been designated a wild and scenic river, and much of the area has been named an area of critical environmental concern to protect plants and animals listed under the Endangered Species Act. There is an effort to designate the Amargosa Basin as a new national monument. Brian Brown is the owner and operator of China Ranch Date Farm. He's involved in actively seeking to preserve this naturally and historically unique region.
My name is Brian Brown. I'm a 4th generation resident of the Mojave Desert. My family has been here since about 1903 in Las Vegas, Shoshone, Baker, and China Ranch. We acquired China Ranch in 1969, and my late wife Bonnie and I moved here in 1979, and I've been here since then. It's it's a long, narrow piece of property in a canyon with a running stream of fresh water. So the Native Americans were obviously in here for thousands of years. 1880s and 90s, it begins to get sort of settled. A Chinese man who came from the borax works in Death Valley settled in the canyon. He was growing fruits and vegetables and chickens and pigs to sell to the mines. So they called it the Chinaman's Ranch, and then eventually it just becomes known as China Ranch. Willow Creek is the name of our freshwater stream that flows here, and about a mile below it empties into the Amargosa River on its way to Badwater in the bottom of Death Valley. So we're a significant tributary of fresh water into the Amargosa. As such, it's been an important place, and it's a very important ecological niche too. We get extremely rare birds and all sorts of that. We have fish here, native desert fish that lives in this stream here. It's a very important place. The river and this river system here are really unique in the Mojave Desert. We irrigate pretty benignly. We operate under a conservation easement agreement with the Nature Conservancy because we realize that the ecological value of this place it's very important and it's very precious. And so part of what we do is we protect that. We have set aside a certain amount of land that will just always remain wildland. The water table so far has remained stable. We do very little groundwater pumping here just for domestic uses. Our big concern is regionally, if over time the pumping, particularly on the Nevada side of the border, where there's a lot of development going on, if that may eventually affect all of our groundwater levels here. So that's a concern, but we don't see any manifestation of it yet here at China Ranch. When Antonio Armijo comes through here, we believe the original mule trail, was able to go steeper, more difficult terrain than wagons, obviously. And so Armijo and the mule people most likely came through here. Later, when the Mormon Road gets laid down over top of it, the grade in and out of this ranch was too steep for wagons. And so there's another drainage called Cowboy Canyon to about a mile to the north. And that was most likely, we think, the route that the wagons went up and down here. But we know John Fremont was here in 1844. He makes notations in his journal that clearly identified the ranch. And he talked about it being the best grazing in the Mojave Desert since he had left California, since he left the other side of Cajon Pass, let's say. And he's got, I don't know, several dozen people and horses and things with him. So they camp here, and he remarks about the freshwater stream and the good grazing. He's headed east on the trail, so they talk about ascending a steep grade and then descending a sandy plain to get to Resting Spring.
From the good grazing around China Ranch, the Old Spanish Trail follows the Amargosa River, or as Armijo called it, Rio de los Payuches, south to Rio Salitroso, which is Salt Creek. It's here, by the Salt Creek Hills, where travelers could find water, wetlands, and a small community serving the nearby mining district. Though prospecting may have begun earlier here, a Mormon party traveling through on the trail found gold and began mining, the first known Mormon mining operation in California. Mining has continued on and off until the present.
In the Death Valley area has an Amargosa mine that was discovered by Latter-day Saint missionaries who had been in the gold fields of California, who are coming to Utah by the southern route. Addison Pratt was the discoverer of the mine. He said, watch these mineral deposits because it looks like a possible prospect, and they found one. And it's been mined off and on for 150 years. I know the owner now, and at one point he smuggled ore out of there in a helicopter.
Modern-day travelers along the Old Spanish Trail can explore the wetlands around the Salt Creek Hills, which is an area of critical environmental concern, and they can explore the mining district. The oldest standing building in San Bernardino County, the Amargosa House, is here as well. The wetlands here are a lush and beautiful contrast to what lay south on the Old Spanish Trail. Pack mule trains, horse and mule traders, and Los Chagonusos, those are raiders who sometimes stole thousands of California horses at a time, as well as prospectors, long-haul wagons, and immigrants, all had to cross the 45-mile, waterless stretch of the Mojave that lies below Salt Creek. The Jornada del Muerto, or Journey of Death, easily traced by following the bleached skeletons of the horses and livestock that didn't survive the journey. But even with the vast distances, deep sand, blazing heat, brackish springs, parched bodies, loss of horses and livestock, friction between travelers and Native Americans, brutality, murder, and retaliation, trading, thieving, and even slaving along the Old Spanish Trail thrived for a time. An uneasy but revealing history of life in the West in the 19th century. Following the trail today offers both insights into the history of the region and the changing landscape of historical sites and trails, as well as the opportunity to experience this landscape for yourself.
This project was made possible with support from California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Visit calhum.org. The Amargosa Conservancy, working toward a sustainable future for the Amargosa River and Basin through science, stewardship, and education. Learn more at amargosaconservancy.org. The Oregon-California Trails Association, preserving the historic emigrant trails legacy by promoting research, education, preservation, and public awareness of America's emigrant trails and their history. Learn more at OCTA-trails.org.